Hi, everybody. Today is a different sort of a video interview. My name is Mihir Wanchoo, and I'm part of Fantasy Book Critic. And joining me today is a special self-published author favorite of mine. Today, we are joined by David Oliver, who is coming to us live and late from the British Isles. And he is, I was introduced to him a long time ago when I read his debut, The Great Hearts. So today we are hoping to kind of interview him, get to talk to him, get to know what his favorites are, why he began writing, and a lot more questions. So David, welcome to the Fantasy Book Critic video interview series. How are you doing?
I'm very good, thanks, Mihir. It's thank you very much for having me. And as I said, I don't think we've ever talked in person before, so it's a pleasure to, after all, a lot of emails back and forth, to finally meet you. So yeah.
Yes, it's the same over here, and you're being very kind. I have bothered you a lot over email, so it is wonderful to meet you in person as well. So while we get started, tell us a bit about yourself. Who is David Oliver?
So I am kind of by day, I work in data science, so project management. But I am kind of I'm an author. So I'm the author of the Great Hearts series, as you mentioned, and also of the newly released Draconis, which is the first in the Draconis Descendant saga. I'm in my kind of other activities, very much into board games, computer games, kind of sword fighting, martial arts, and gymnastics, climbing, that kind of thing. So a good mix of stuff. And I feel like a lot of those kind of activities end up in a lot of my books, to be honest. Probably why it's a lot of fast-paced action, I think, by and large.
I was just going to say that, that's a good reason why there's that many sword fights and martial arts, action sequences, and they're done really well. We'll be coming to that in just a bit because I wanted to talk to you about the third book as well, but we'll talk about that later.
Sure.
All right. I know your debut came out in, I believe, May of 2017. This is, the debut of Great Hearts. So you obviously have started writing before that. So when and why did you decide to become an author or a writer? Can you talk us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it was a fairly organic process, I think. It kind of came about because my partner at the time was basically decided to start writing. And I think I got a little bit bored and thought, well, I could start writing too. And it turns out I liked it a little bit more, really, and stuck with it. So I started writing the Great Hearts in 2016, and I'm not one of those authors who kind of sits down and plans everything out to intricate details in advance. I sat down, and the kind of first chapter was pretty much just done on paper. And I think I'd been reading a lot of, at the time, a lot of kind of Mark Lawrence, a lot of grimdark stories, which had obviously kind of heavily influenced my work. And I think at the time I was really thinking about how do people become kind of perhaps the gray or morally dark, corrupted individuals that you often see in grimdark novels. So the Great Hearts is kind of a split timeline. So it's based on you see kind of the same character in the present day as kind of an older person who is a bit darker through kind of past deeds, but the vast majority of it takes place kind of as he's growing up. So starts off as fairly innocent child. The classic fantasy trauma kind of happens, and then his kind of journey starts, and so on and so forth. The idea being that eventually it will all meet up and go from there. But you'll see that kind of protagonist's journey in how you see him in the first scene, essentially, of the first book.
All right. Wow. So to quote George R.R. Martin, you are a pantser, sir. You just decided, sat down. You just sat down and wrote, and that scene just came out. Okay, well, that's good to know. Now, to kind of ask you a little bit of a side question, what drove you to fantasy specifically? I know you kind of have mentioned that, your love for Mark Lawrence, but, if not for your partner writing whatever book they were writing, would you have written some other genre, or was it always going to be fantasy for you?
It's always going to be fantasy. My kind of maybe sci-fi. It's something that I might be interested in dipping my toe in later on, but fantasy has always been my main draw. I'm currently pretty addicted to lit RPG, plowing through vast amounts of that very quickly. But no, I kind of I think I started kind of a love of fantasy at a very, very early age. So obviously reading the classics, The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, which was very in keeping with kind of my age group at the time. Philip Pullman, kind of the Dark Materials series. But I actually think the main influence on myself and my love for fantasy was Redwall, by Brian Jacks, who I have a pretty vast collection of his books, and it's I think it's a really impressive world he built that is. I've read them recently, and they still stand up as to an adult reading. It's obviously still based largely as a child audience, but it's still quite impressive at how it's crafted. It's really good fantasy worlds, but obviously based around talking animals, which for kids, I mean, that was like the gateway for me. And it's still your classic kind of, not necessarily swords and sorcery, but definitely swords, combat, epic adventures, journeys, that kind of thing. And that really lit that idea of fantasy and in myself, which I think I've just never really stepped back from reading fantasy. So yeah, kind of love the vast majority of genres, to be honest. So currently working my way through Wheel of Time. Obviously, the new Amazon series has got me into that. I hadn't actually read it beforehand. Malazan, into the big ones as well. But as I say, kind of mixing it with a lot of lit RPG and that kind of thing.
Well, all I can say is all the best with Wheel of Time and Malazan. They're both dense, heavy series, and also cornerstones from like the early. Well, not one of them was early 90s, one of them was late 90s, almost early 2000s as well. You're leading a lot of lit RPG as well, so that's good. Kind of, it's good to kind of jump in between with some lighter books in between those heavy fairs, so to speak. Another curious thing I noticed is that all of your, childhood, or not childhood, like growing up inspirations, they're all British authors. So kudos on that. With Harry Potter, Philip Pullman, Brian Jacks, obviously Tolkien and everything. So that's definitely an interesting field. Now, I want to come back to, the part of like how you got started, because you mentioned that you basically just sat down and wrote the first scene. Now, when you say this first scene, was it the prologue scene are you talking about, or the first chapter, which is, set in the past?
It was the prologue scene, actually.
Okay.
So I wrote this, for anyone who hasn't read this, the first scene in The Great Heart is by far the darkest. The first prologue and the first chapter are probably the two darkest moments in the series so far. And I sat down and wrote the prologue scene, which was kind of the protagonist as he is now, who is kind of a self-confessed murderer, fairly twisted individual. And then once I finished that scene, I think at the time I was like, well, do I continue along this path? I think no, that's probably a bit too dark for me. So I was like, how does this person become like this? And that's basically where chapter 1, chapter 2 kind of came from, really, which was I just started writing, and all of a sudden it was actually, the story wasn't about this kind of 30-year-old who's done a lot of horrible things. It was how that kid has become that kind of twisted 30-year-old. And I should say, he's not some kind of morally horrendous individual. There's a lot of reasons why he becomes the way he is, which hopefully is explained through the following books.
Well, good. And I just want to quickly read out like a quick the start of the blurb on the behind of the Great Hearts, because it'll kind of jive into what you're just saying. I am what the Emperor made me, monster. And this is the key. I am what the Emperor made me. For all those people who haven't read these books, Kaladin Darkheart, as the main character is described, he is a monster, a self-described monster, but he's doing this for a reason. He's actually, in many ways, I wouldn't even say an anti-hero. He's a true hero. He has his reasons, and of course, you find out why, even within the first book itself. It's not that you have to read, that much further on. Okay, so you said that. So did Kaladin, come to your mind fully created? Like, because when you said the first scene, he is in his 30s. The prologue, which is described like they're hunting somebody, Kaladin, and I believe his best friend / only person who can stand him, Cassius, they're hunting somebody. Is what to be as mild spoilery as possible. Did that, like, how did it all start in your mind? Like, did Kaladin and Cassius emerge fully formed, or was it an idea of somebody hunting someone, or was it something else? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
So I think Caladan was always meant to be kind of someone who you don't see much of kind of his powers in the first kind of prologue scene. You don't see any of it, in fact. He's just meant to be a fairly normal individual, or he comes across as it. And his kind of best friend Cassius, who something is immediately off because he's described as kind of oversized, gigantic, and kind of mad. So he doesn't seem to understand Caladan. He doesn't, but he carries a massive greatsword and is obviously very adept at hunting people, hunting monsters, that kind of thing. And you don't get too much reasoning as to why that's the case, obviously, in the prologue, but Caladan as the character in that kind of like that current present day character just kind of came out to me as kind of, I think, almost an answer to a lot of the current materials out there. So you take kind of any you take Mark Lawrence's books, Joe Abercrombie's books. It's you can pretty much plagiarize and in a nice way pick a character, and chances are there is a 20, 30 something guy who uses a sword or something like that, right? So it was almost a very easy thing to have Caladan Darkheart in that prologue created. He is a dark, twisted person, because obviously the character development isn't there in that first opening chapter. I always thought the Cassius twist was something that was a little bit more interesting to me personally in that prologue, because that was for me anyway, when I was writing it, was the hook as to, okay, so why is there someone who is 8 feet tall and massively muscular, carrying a huge sword, and seemingly can't speak, and I think is described in the prologue as kind of completely and utterly mad. So for me, a lot of this journey is trying to understand exactly how Cassius becomes the way Cassius is, as well as Caladan. And that was a journey that, obviously when I wrote it, I had absolutely no idea how he was going to become like that. I do now, I'm happy to say. So for everyone potentially watching, I do understand how it all works out.
Well, that actually leads me to my next question, because the way you're describing it, and just for some historical context for the viewers, the Great Hearts book 1, or just Great Hearts, came out in 2017, but the sequel, Great Hearts 2: A Game of Gods, came out in 2021. Now, again, to your words that you were a pantser. Did it take you that much long to figure out where the direction of the series was going, or was it just due to life events? Of course, we also had the pandemic in the middle of it all. So can you walk us through of how you went from writing that one single awesome fantasy, dark to grimdark fantasy debut to making it a series?
So I actually can't blame it on the pandemic. It was a lot of life events, but also it was because I, as soon as I finished writing the first Great Hearts, I started writing Draconis. And that was a story that I think almost in my own head, I think was a bit of escapism. And that is it is a fun action adventure novel. So it is as far removed from kind of grimdark as you could possibly get, really. And that was kind of a story that just came to me. It was stuck in my head as soon as I finished The Great Hearts. I was like, it just really wanted to get written. I had this idea of a kind of an expeditionary leader, and what happens if essentially if they find some new technology, some new, in this instance, magic, and that what happens if that sparks an arms race. So that was just an idea that I couldn't get out of my head. So I just started writing Draconis, and I think I published Great Hearts in May 2017. I had the first kind of 100,000 words of Draconis done within the 6 months following. And then I started, the bit more business savvy side of me thought I should probably be working on the second Great Hearts. So I started doing both in tandem. That didn't work too well at the time. So I continued with Draconis, got the first draft done at something like 240,000 words. And I believe I finished that kind of the first draft 2019, and then started working properly on the second Great Hearts. In all actuality, I did that the majority of the second book in about 6 months, and then revised it numerous times along with revising Draconis. So I think something I've learned is doing 2 books at the same time just takes a lot longer than focusing entirely on one. But yeah, I can't blame the pandemic. I released I actually had Draconis almost ready to go, but I decided to release Great Hearts 2 first, and then write and complete Great Hearts 3, and release that, and then release Draconis. So I suppose that shows the difference in that I managed to do the third Great Hearts in again about 6 months, and then edit it and release it. So focusing entirely on one definitely does work for me in terms of a speed side of things. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. And also, to your point, the Great Heart books, which you're describing, even though you write them in 6 months, they're on the shorter side. Like, they are, and when I say shorter side, I mean fantasy's version of short, not like, any other genre's version of short. Like they are, I believe, like anywhere from 100,000 to maybe just a little bit about 120,000 or so.
Yes, so the first one I think is 96, 98. And I think the third one is the longest at about 130,000. Which again pales in comparison to Draconis, which I think sits around 202.
Mm-hmm. They are very fast spaced. I will have to give you that. Like the dual timelines, or just subject matter, it helps. Like they're very fast spaced. You don't even realize like when they're over, you're like, I need the next one, or at least that's just me.
I'm glad to hear that. That's great.
Oh, I'm gonna be bugging you for more. I have more questions about the world and everything. But I do want to ask you, what led you to self-publishing them? Not that I'm complaining, because I believe you can get them out a lot earlier, you have a lot more control, but just with the advent of self-publishing nowadays, there is definitely an option. Previously it was considered vanity publishing. It was considered for the foolish, like you could never get your hand in or foot in traditional publishing corners. But now that there is kind of like an equal footing, what drew you to one side more than the other?
Yes, it's interesting. I don't think there's an equal footing, so to speak. Obviously, traditional publishing is still extremely hard to get into, and even it's hard to get into even if you go down the getting an agent route, first and foremost. I think for myself, I always just thought Great Hearts was a fun series. When I first released it, I didn't actually think that many people would be particularly interested in the first book. I think I wrote in the end, the last few pages, kind of the author's note. I said I wrote it for me to see if I could, and I don't disagree with that statement now, a couple of years later. It definitely was a book that I thought I wanted to read at the time. So I wasn't entirely sure that anyone else would be particularly interested. So the fact that people have been, like yourself, has been fantastic. And that's really what's kind of led me to kind of continue writing, because I find it a very cathartic and enjoyable experience, to be honest. And I'm just as eager to because I'm a pantser, obviously, I'm just as eager to find out how the rest of the story goes. But it's, I would love to go kind of, I think personally, it would be, I think the perfect world is to have a traditional publishing kind of half and then a self-publishing half. I think you see a lot of the bigger authors, Michael Sullivan, Brian Sanderson, who we can talk about with his ridiculous Kickstarter lately, which has been amazing. But you can see a lot of them have obviously they've gone down the traditional route and built a massive fan base because that's what traditional publishing gets you. Obviously, if it all works out, but then you get so much more profit if you can do it yourself and you've built that base and you just move them across to self-publishing. So obviously, self-publishing on Amazon at least is kind of 70% royalties, which I think is very attractive. However, 70% of nothing is nothing. So you have to do a lot of work yourself. But I also quite enjoy that. So I did the original cover. The one that you do not have was designed by myself, which pales in comparison to Jake's version of it. So Jake Caleb has done all my covers. But doing all of that, learning how to market, it's learning how to do websites and things. I actually find that fascinating. So for me, it's been really rewarding experience. And one, I think, is something that I think I'm quite proud of having done. And I think it's a really good experience for people to take on new challenges. So I honestly think anyone could probably write if they wanted to. I had no idea that I could beforehand. Whether or not we can all write well is a different thing. I'm still not sure if I'm like at that top end, but hopefully it keeps improving as we go forwards. Yeah.
Well, no, I completely hear you on that, and you're right. One funny thing about Michael J. Sullivan that you mentioned, he actually began as a self-published author. I remember this because we at Fantasy Book Critic were actually reviewing his earlier books. He got a deal with Orbit. He moved on to Orbit, and of course, became even bigger. And now I think he's kind of doing like a little bit of a hybrid thing in the most, well, not funny, but like in the most intriguing way, because he still publishes some books, with the traditional publishers. Then he goes for Kickstarters for like the audio and everything. And so now he's a burgeoning, kind of like a brilliant mind. And of course, to speak of Brandon Sanderson, I just checked his Kickstarter today morning, 23.6 million. One of my friends, who has never read a book, he messaged me a New York Times article. He's like, "Do you know of this?" I'm like, "Yes, I know about this. Yes, I know who this guy is." But he was just shocked. Like, there is like this thing happening. I'm like, "Yeah." He said, "We'll talk more when we meet." But yeah, it's such a big deal.
I think it's officially the most funded Kickstarter. Is that right?
Yes.
So,
yep.
And they say that fantasy is not a great niche to be in a lot of the time, right? As an author, but obviously he is. He's not even the 1%, right? He's the 0.001% with that. That's because I think Michael Sullivan just finished a Kickstarter and that was around $100,000, $200,000, right?
Something of that sort. We'll have to take a look at. But his before that, well, to your point, Brandon Sanderson, I would say he's a league of one. He's all by himself. Michael J. Sullivan previously, until then, he used to kind of keep on coming with the Kickstarters, which he would raise the bar more and more and more. So he had that standard all by himself. Poor guy, of course, they don't know that my Brandon Sanderson is just going to come out and release and destroy everyone's expectations.
Well, I remember reading a really interesting post by Michael Sullivan, which was talking about the audio rights, which so I narrated the Great Hearts, the first one, and I do intend to narrate the second and third. Unfortunately, in a new flat, new environment, I don't have somewhere that's quiet enough to kind of do that at this point in time. But I remember Michael Sullivan's post talking about how the traditional publishers were basically just saying you must include audio rights, and it was the same rate. And I'm sure his post was saying something like he just directly approached an audio only company, and they offered him like a 6-figure sum just for the audio rights. So I believe that's why he does that, right? He's split it out. And why not? If you've got that kind of following and you've got that ability to do so, sure. It's much better than the publishing house getting it.
Oh yeah, no, I absolutely remember which post you're talking about, and I will link to that post specifically within this interview on YouTube. I remember you're right, because the publishers were said you can we want all the rights, audio is included, we're not going to give you any extra money for that. And he's like, no, and he was prescient about this. This was like, I think at least 4 or 5 years ago, when he kind of he thought about this, like audio is going to be the next boom, and he did not want the audio rights to be basically bundled alongside over there. And now we have it. And you're right about the most recent Kickstarter. It is it actually funded yesterday. It was the Fairy Lane by Michael J. Sullivan fantasy novel. It funded at just over 200,000. I say just over 200,000. It has,
and Michael Sullivan's, he's huge, right?
Yes.
I think that just shows this slight difference between kind of the 1% and then Brandon Sanderson.
Yes. Well, to be fair to Michael Sullivan and to Brandon Sanderson, I mean, yes, Brandon Sanderson started out with Thor books in 2006, and again, I remember this because I read his debut Elantris. He was a famous, I mean, not, I would say famous, he was a good author in his own right, but then of course he took on the Wheel of Time. Wheel of Time, he successfully completed it. I think that just propelled him amongst the fans, because the Wheel of Time fan base was already over maybe millions of readers strong all over the world, and then suddenly got exposed to Brandon Sanderson's his version, or I would say the books 12, 13, and 14. And then of course they were like, okay, now we know this guy does a good job. What else has he written? And then he had an extensive backlog. So that kind of, I mean, of course, Tor was happy because they were like, yeah, sell his, we'll sell his books, we'll sell Robert Jordan's books. It's just great for us. Until now, I mean, I'm pretty sure they must have some thoughts about this Kickstarter.
Yeah, definitely.
It's just climbing. It's fun to sometimes I just check in every day just to see what the amount has climbed in on. It's, I think, like I said, 23.6 million when I checked earlier this morning. Over 99,000 people have contributed to the Kickstarter, and it's just in its third or fourth day. And fun. I just found out today, Will White. Have you heard of Will White?
Yeah.
He's actually going to do a Kickstarter as well.
The Cradle.
Yes, he's doing a Kickstarter for the hardcover editions of the first 3 books of Cradle, and in fact, he's done a very fun video. It's like I'll try to link that as well. But he's done a fun video about it's not exactly mocking Brandon Sanderson, but it's kind of like it's a silly look at what Brandon Sanderson did and how he's presenting it. It's just funny. I like Will White. He's a really gregarious guy, and it kind of shines through his humor in this video. So.
I mean, his books are fantastic. They are that sweet spot, I think, of action fantasy, and that's kind of the area that I think I try and emulate at times. He's amazing at doing kind of fast-paced fights that really kind of suck you in. Definite page turners. They're the kind of thing you just plow through. I think he's got 10 books out now, and it's just you can just eat them up.
I believe so. I've not read far in the series, but I believe you might be right. 9 or 10 books, and I think it's going to offer possible 12-book series. So, but yeah, I'm now just excited to see what his Kickstarter does, how quickly it funds, how well it funds, and all of that. So,
I think it'll be another huge one because he's he's generally kind of #1 bestseller when a new book comes out on the Kindle store. So,
he could probably, you could put him in the title. He's one of the most best, he's probably the biggest best-selling author everybody has never heard of, except for his fans, and they're huge. They are legion, as they say.
They really are.
All right. Getting back to your books, because I love your books, and I want to ask you this: the Great Heart series. Not only the first book, but books here. I have them all thanks to you. That's book number 1. That's book number 2, and then we have book number 3. These 3 books and the series, they're like a unique amalgamation of dark, like I said, dark to grim, dark fantasy. This is a little bit of a spoiler, but it's not truly, because you won't know what it is. It's science fiction as well to a certain degree. There's the dual timelines, like you mentioned, and there's monsters. And I would say there's a hint of heroic fantasy. Just for those folks who, again, for me, who loved, who grew, who were exposed to David Gemmell, who like Anthony Ryan's books, there is that veneer, so as to speak, of heroic fantasy via certain characters, and the characterization well done. But my question is, there's a lot going on. How do you make it work? How do you make it such that there's such a complex but yet so enjoyable mix to read?
So my process for the second and third books, at least, has been to write the present day section last. So I write it almost as a completely separate book, because it is two completely separate timelines. The present day isn't really impacting, on any of the timeline that you're seeing. You're spending majority of the book reading. But so I generally write the kind of past Caladan, past Cassius section. And then once I've done that, I'm able to kind of bring in the present day and obviously make that perhaps have a bit of foreshadowing and things for based on what I've already written on the past side of things. But you're right, it is, there's a lot going on, especially with the sci-fi elements as well, trying to work that in. And I think from a world building perspective, if I sit back and probably looked at it all, I'll be like, that is a scary mess. Because there is a lot to kind of unpack. But I think I've got the characters kind of so embedded in my own head that I kind of have a pretty good idea of how it's all going to kind of intertwine and mesh. And a large part of this is all going to revolve around kind of the we've mentioned briefly the Emperor. There is kind of the Emperor is for anyone kind of who hasn't read it, it is the person who is responsible for the protagonist becoming, as you said before, I am what the Emperor made me, monster. But when you first meet the Emperor, he's obviously a very charming person. But he is in this world, there are certain people who have magic abilities. They use magic that's called Seraph. And the Emperor is incredibly powerful. He's kind of lived for eons, and has abilities far beyond kind of anyone else, except when you kind of read into later ones, there are several other people who have similar abilities, and they're kind of known as the powers, essentially. And they kind of run and play games with their own little empires. And a lot of the third book in particular, and the kind of forthcoming books, is going to be revolving around how the powers interact. And a lot of this is kind of just understanding that kind of the normal human is kind of seen as little more than an ant to these people, which hopefully helps to go and understand why certain kind of characters become the way they are, and if they're used or not, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I think the sci-fi element was, looking at it, I think that was something I really, really liked from Mark Lawrence's books. And as I mentioned before, I always really liked sci-fi as well. It is something that I'd be interested in taking on. And so adding that kind of element in wasn't too tricky. And I do think we'll see more of it, but I've always just kind of loved that post-apocalyptic idea, especially of technology. And people who are living in a feudal medieval age, and you have a rusting kind of robot behind them. I think the cover of Gunmetal Gods kind of is a perfect example. I think that's an absolutely brilliant piece of art that really captures exactly what I'm trying to kind of suggest. This ancient technology, the people who have somehow fallen to become what everyone is now. I mean, I think that's a story that has been told so many times, but there's a reason why that's the case, because it's fascinating every time.
It is. It absolutely is. And yeah, to your point, Gunmetal Gods, it's very grimdark. I have to say this, and the only reason I say this, like I like grimdark, but like it was actually within our group this current SPFPO edition. So it was one of our semi-finalists, and we had a very difficult choice between that one and the Rolska Groans ultimately. And it was not just me. There's like 3 other judges. We all decided read all, those 2 and a couple of other books and titles as well. We had like a wide range of titles, but yeah, eventually we decided on Rolska. But yeah, there's like I can't really spoil why Gunmetal Gods still reside in my mind, but yeah, it begins out as grimdark fantasy, kind of like very R. Scott Bakker-esque, with the fact that there's going to be that they're kind of looking at like a it's set in kind of like a Middle Eastern world. There's possibly like a crusade like thing going on, or the beginnings of one. And then of course you find out like, whoa, wait a second, there's more. Compared to what Zamil did, I want to talk about this, the SF reveal in book 1 of The Great Hearts. Now, from the start of the book, you have set it in a world which is not exactly medieval, but there's hints about it. So, and of course, it feels, the readers can fill in from their own minds. The past kind of gives us a clue that, oh yeah, it looks to be, but it's not exactly, we don't really know if it's medieval Europe, if it's medieval, the American or the lands which are later going to be known as American lands, or even medieval Asia, so as to speak. And then towards kind of like the latter 1/3 is when that SF reveal happens, the science fiction reveal happens. Mild spoilers, apologies for that. But do you feel now, again, after having written 3 or 4 books, that perhaps that could have been better? I don't want to say better written, because it was like an absolute shocker. The reason why I say this is I loved it, but I've read reviews where some people have said like, maybe there could have been some hints laced about it, or somehow it kind of like, they were not turned off, but they were just like, whoa, what's this kind of a thing.
Yeah, I think there are. I feel like there's and this isn't obviously to blame readers in any way, shape, or form, but I feel like there is certain readers who are like, fantasy must be fantasy, and then other readers who are sci-fi must be sci-fi, and then there's a much smaller section where it's like, yeah, anything goes. I'm definitely in the middle. I like merging things together and seeing what happens, because why not? If it's entertaining to read, it'd be great. I do think looking back at it, yes, with kind of, I think, where my skills are now, if I went back at and redid it, I could definitely kind of add a little bit more. That's not to say there aren't hints, but I think they're probably a little bit too subtle, not even intentionally. But I think it's things like the first time you go to the Emperor's Citadel in the first book, there are hints that things are perhaps more modern, kind of hidden platforms, and electric lights. And that's pretty much what you get, really. Everything else is kind of medieval. But I think a large part of that is also because I didn't want the so the idea, obviously, no one who's reading the book at this point in time really, I don't want to cloud anyone's judgment, but I've seen reviews of the first book where people are like, the Emperor is such a nice guy, and then when I finished writing the first book, I was like, the Emperor's really not a nice guy. And I feel like most people kind of get that, and that obviously goes in the second and third book, you get much more into that. But I wanted to make it so that it isn't just kind of a instantly revealed, the Emperor has all the power, all the technology, and hoards it all. It's something that is intended to be kind of revealed over time, and kind of help understand why people are become the way they are, because they are almost indoctrinated to the Emperor at this point, right? And so, yeah, I think, yes, I could totally have put a few more bits of sci-fi throughout. And I do think that the kind of info dump world building section in the third bit, whilst I really do enjoy it on the reread, and I think a lot of people do enjoy it, yes, I could handle that, I think, slightly better. Because it is quite a jarring probably shift. Would you agree on that yourself? Is it a little bit kind of?
I liked it, like, honestly, because I like books when authors do something new. even if it is not successful, I'm not saying that this was not successful. I'm just saying, like, even if it was not successful, I like to see it because, you know, we all have read the same fantasy, you know, medieval fantasy, you know, you want to say military academy, we have read it. Yes, you know, there are good books, people who can do nice twists here and there, but it's still the same thing. I loved what you did. Like, you know, even though I was loving the whole dual timeline, and of course, beginning with Caledon, where he's this angry person, and you kind of see the horrible traumatic events that are going on, and, you know, how he gets back to the school where he becomes or where he's trying to become an imperator. All of that was fun. But when that end sequence, where, and you call it an infodump, I wouldn't say call it an infodump, because it was actually, it flowed organically because of the way the events were happening, the characters needed to have those questions answered. And it made sense for those characters to be asking this question. So for me, I did not feel that it was an infodump. I like infodumps. I'm weird like that, but still, it made sense for me because the way the scenario was unfolding at that moment, it made sense that the characters would have those questions. And the other side was revealing as much as they wanted to, with of course, you know, intentions kept in mind. So all of that played out really nicely for me. Again, I might be in a minority. You know, being the writer, you would know best about it all. But I feel like now, you know, now that if readers could read all 3 books together, they would enjoy it even more, because then they're like, you know, I mean, I had to wait 3 years. Not that it's a big deal. We are of course fantasy readers, so we know all about the pain of waiting, you know, years and years between books.
It's true.
But just for the fact, like, and these books are pretty fast reads. Like, you know, with everything that is in, you know, you put in them, you still read so fast. So, you know, kudos to you, sir. I really love them.
Thank you very much.
So, sorry, you were saying?
No, I was just saying it's. I think, again, having a fast-paced series is something that I've always I really enjoy. Going back to kind of Cradle, right? I think that's probably one of the reasons why Cradle is so good. It's probably one of the reasons why Lit RPG has taken off in a large way as well.
Yep.
Fast-paced books that are, it almost goes back to that kind of pop sci-fi, pop fantasy kind of books you used to get in the 80s, you know, Sword and Sorcery. Something that is very easy to just read, and that's probably a direct counter to things like Malazan and things like Wheel of Time. And as much as I kind of love those books as well, but there is you kind of almost need a palate cleanser, I think. Because, you know, yeah.
Not to knock your book short, they're complex as well. You know, they're not like when you, because I do understand where you're coming from with the fast-paced stuff. Like, you know, as much as they're fast-paced, they're not like a one-trick pony. You know, there's like not just that happening. There's like, and for the viewers as well, it's dark fantasy. It is in the past. There's a military academy setting. I don't know about you all. I love those things. You know, the Blood Song by Anthony Ryan was like, you know, gave a nice dose of that. So this one kind of has that. There's, even though the books are from one person's POV, and the second and third books, there's other POVs being added, but it feels like all the characters feel alive. And of course, there's the monsters. So there's that too. So it's fun. It's what I'm saying. It's fun. It's dark, and it'll keep you guessing as to what's happening, because there's those 2 timelines. And like, you know, David said, the Imperator, he's an asshole. Let's put it this way. He's a charming asshole, but still an asshole. And you find out why more and more. So keep your eyes peeled. Well, I do have another question for you with regards to Great Hearts. When's book number 4 coming out, and what's it going to be about?
So book 4, I'm working on it now. First draft is about kind of 40,000 in. If my current books are anything to go by, it'll probably needs another 100,000 words before it'll be kind of done. It is, so as I kind of mentioned, book 2 and 3 kind of go more into how the powers, these kind of ridiculously powerful beings who have kind of long ascended, being just kind of a normal human, are controlling things. And book 4 is going to be kind of a continuation of that. We have there was a large section of the third book which was based around kind of assassinations, kind of thriller elements, with kind of a cult of portaling ability assassins. Those will come back in, as well as kind of the quote unquote shadow cable. So there are elements of that, but it's the fourth book is I think a large large parts of my books kind of based around a certain area. So the second one was based largely around the fourth year test, which was kind of this harrowing exam that they had to do that was about survival, and that was kind of a large chunk of that second book was around that and the impact it had on everyone as a character. The third book was around kind of these shadowy assassins that are being used in the background, and then kind of a big sci-fi finish and lots of explosions, obviously. And then the fourth one is going to be around the progression in the academy. So Caladan, Cassius, and everyone is going to be kind of moving into the 6th and 7th year. And there's going to be 8 years within the academy. So this fourth book's going to be focusing on the 6th and 7th. And those years are where they are going to learn how to become monster hunters. So as you've kind of mentioned, I love monsters. I love putting monsters into my books. And when we got into Draconis, I'm sure you say there's a lot of monsters in that book. And yeah. So Caladan and Cassius are kind of, as they're learning to become something called an imperator, which is kind of the emperor's hitman, assassin, pretty much everything tool. They have specified to become kind of a monster slayers. And a large part of it will be an investigation into why the number of monsters are increasing, number of attacks are increasing, and that is going to loop into the hopefully start instigating thoughts as to where the strange race of creatures known as the Thurken started to come from. So that's a kind of a creature that you see in the kind of present day view in the first book. And the suggestion is that they kind of hordes of them came out of nowhere, very militarized, kind of human but lizard-like. So the fourth book is going to start exploring and hinting a bit more as to where and why and how. So hopefully it all ties together. And yeah, books 5 and 6. 5 will be kind of the last year of the don't hold me to this, by the way. I'm a pantser. So. This is a loose outline, but book 5 will be kind of the last year of the academy. They will become fully fledged imperators, and then it's going to be about when everything starts going wrong. So at some point we're going to have this invasion by the Thurken. That will likely be kind of book 5, and that we're probably going to get a lot of big battles. All the events have to happen to allow Cassius to become larger, to become insane. And then hopefully book 6 is kind of a culmination of everything. And we'll see what happens.
I was going to say, you are, with all of these plans, you're just like ruining your reputation as a pantser, with the way you're just like, oh, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. I'm like, okay, he said he was a pantser, but this is actually like a plotter. So
it's set pieces that, I have a couple of set pieces in mind, and it kind of gets built around those.
I'm kidding. I whatever works, I completely understand, because each writer is different, any which way. I'm just glad that you have a plan, because I can definitely understand, especially with pantsers, sometimes, and I know, and I'm not talking about you, but I'm talking about other pantsers, because sometimes I've had authors who said, well, I had this general idea, but because I didn't plot out enough, or like you mentioned, the set pieces, they kind of get stuck, and they won't know that they're stuck until they're maybe thousands of words in, and that's when it's really hard to kind of discard those and come back in. Yeah,
writing yourself into a corner is definitely an easy thing to do, right?
Okay. And you kind of also answered my next question, which was going to be, how many books are you planning for the Great Heart series? So there we have it, folks. There's a potential for 6 books, but of course, do not hold David to it. He will write them as he writes them. All right, let's shift a little bit to your most recent release. David was super kind enough to send me the ARC for Draconis, and we will be having a giveaway for the hardback edition. It is already out. So
this one, which I don't you can't really see on my screen, can you? There you go.
There we go. We do see it. So there it is, the gorgeous hardcover. And is the cover also done by J. Caleb Clark?
It is, yeah.
Awesome. For folks, all of David's books, all 3 previous Great Hearts books, as well as the Draconis series, are all done by J. Caleb Clark. He's a really good designer as well. All right. So now you have mentioned that you actually started writing Draconis a long time ago, now nearly 4 or 5 years ago. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about, like, what was the idea? Because again, you were going back to your Panther roots. What was the idea that led to the inception of this book and potentially series?
So, I kind of envisage Draconis as being kind of either a very large 2-book series or a 3-book kind of trilogy. At least this section of it.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that came into my head was an expedition. And I think a large part of this was quite heavily influenced by Anthony Ryan's Draconis Memorabilia saga.
Mm-hmm.
So that, and strangely enough, The Mummy, the kind of Brendan Fraser film, Indiana Jones, that kind of thing, kind of adventure, tomb robbing, and monsters, really. And as well as being kind of a bit of swashbuckling, lighthearted fun. It's a direct kind of counter to my previous series in that respect. I think it was probably I'd spent too much time in Caladan Darkheart's mind, and needed a bit of a break to kind of do something a bit more fun and lighthearted. So for me, the as I kind of mentioned before, the idea is, or that came to my mind, was this expeditionary leader who has discovered a portal somewhere to a new land, a new world, what have you, and it brings something back that completely changes the world. Now that was the idea that I ran with, and that became magic. Essentially, they find, so we're talking kind of a kind of almost like a Victorian era world at the time, and then all of a sudden they get the ability to inscribe runes, and to use these runes to perform magic. And Draconis was almost, I think, heavily influenced by hard magic systems, so probably a lot of my lit RPG reading and that kind of things. So I remember my editor telling me off for this and asking me to make things a lot more soft. But I think for me, the idea of having a rune system, for instance, where you can power it using a steam engine, and thus, in the book they have runes of weightlessness, of feather, and so they connect them all, inscribe all these runes on a ship, tether all these runes to a steam engine. All of a sudden they have a flying ship, and all of a sudden a country has become an air power. And then the threads started running as to, well, what happens when that happens? And obviously it wasn't intentional, but obviously really bad time for this kind to be coming back, Cold War era kind of stuff. But at the time I was thinking, well, obviously it is kind of space race, arms race, that kind of thing, because if a country suddenly gets runes and becomes the next kind of overnight, the next most powerful kind of controlling force, what's going to happen? So half of the book is about kind of people going into the Rift to explore more and kind of exploring all that fantastical stuff that they find within. And the other half is people who are kind of defending the country, the Ursal Federation, who, because they are under attack from other countries, kind of both in terms of clandestine attacks and so on and so forth, trying to steal secrets, that kind of thing. So yeah, it was really kind of a mixture of exploration and what then, essentially. Yeah.
Wow, sounds awesome. And because also I want to, before I get to the next question, I just want to highlight this, tease out this thing, like, they discovered these rune stones by Jalen Sear. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, or if not, please correct me.
Jelaine is the way I always pronounce it.
Jelaine, okay, Jelaine Sear. Thank you. It kind of, basically makes the Ursal Federation. Now, I thought they were like a business conglomerate.
They are, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So they kind of like come.
This was based essentially off the East India Trading Company, kind of in the 18th century, 17th century, which was a company so powerful that it's kind of like Apple today, probably could buy a country. So the idea is that, they became powerful enough to become their own country.
Yep. As an Indian, I know all about the East India Company, all the British, the French, the Dutch, all of those ones. But no, you're right. Historically speaking, they became so powerful and so rich that literally the Queen of England said, she basically made the CEO of the company her minister, and all the underlings got, legal post within her kingdom, and she then became ascended, like it was kind of like a lateral but slightly upper move to become the Empress of India and all the other colonies. That's how successful and vicious, to us to speak, in a way they were. Yeah. But no, coming back to the Ursula Federation, they basically overnight, because of these rune stones, become the top dog, and the previous top dogs, so as to speak, are suddenly left without any counter to them. That's kind of like the exploration part of this one.
That's it, yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. It sounds really, like, it is really cool. Having read that, it is really cool, because there's that, there's this kind of like espionage element to it, but at the same time, there's also the monsters and the monster exploration within it. And you seem to, sir, have taken it upon yourself. It's almost like I was reading like a video game, because it's like at each level, as they went into the rift, into the new world, the monsters became scarier, they became meaner, and they became bigger, so as to speak.
I think I kind of wanted to so spoiler, there are dragons in Draconis, but I think I wanted to kind of get that feeling of wonder, and for me, so in the Great Hearts, for instance, a lot of the monsters are based off things that I think, I look at current animals and things like that, and it's like, well, what happens if they're mutated or over thousands of years, that kind of thing. With Draconis, I could throw all of that out the window. It's a completely separate world. You can do whatever you want, essentially. The normal rules don't apply. And I wanted to make, in particular with dragons, I wanted to make them these kind of completely awe-inspiring creatures, not necessarily something that not the size of a horse or anything like that, but something that almost blots out the sun, something that is so far beyond anything. Even if you're on a sailing ship with loads of cannon, you're completely nothing to it. So it was kind of, that was the far end. I was like, I will have dragons with, which are going to be the showstoppers. And then there's going to be kind of, the smaller creatures that they run into, and then there's going to be this kind of gradient of everything in between. Mm-hmm. And it's not necessarily bad things. I wanted, nice creatures as well. There's a scene which I'm particularly fond of, which is kind of they're sailing and through the sky, and they see a bunch of essentially large flying whales, which are kind of like almost they're white, and they kind of think they're sailing ships at first through the clouds. So again, it's trying to get that kind of sense of wonder and exploration, and you don't know what's coming next. And then I think some of it's based on folklore. So obviously we have stories about dragons, we have stories about mermaids, harpies, whatever, you name it, there's something there. So I put the kind of rift, this portal to this other world, excuse me, in the middle of the ocean, kind of hidden away through a magical storm. But there's certain things that are escaping from the rift. So, and that was kind of, to me, it's like, well, how long has the rift been there? I don't know. So maybe that's where those kind of stories and legends that the sailors have, maybe that's why they're there in the first place. But yeah, so I mean, you say that the monsters start small, but I think the first one you actually meet is the sea drake, which is big enough to sink a ship, right? So
it does, but we don't technically see like the sea drake, fully. Like, we see kind of the sailors are scared, they see the ship sinking, and like it's more of hidden. It's like a nautical terror, which that it's too huge. We don't really see it, because kind of like the first proper, and sorry, again, spoilers, the harpies that you mentioned, they're really scary, but you kind of see them at first, and then of course more stuff happens.
Yeah, definitely.
And also, to your point, not a spoiler, there's dragons on the cover. The title is Draconis. I mean, like, unless you are literally not looking at the cover, or maybe let's say if you bought the book for the thumbnail and maybe you didn't really peer closely enough, I can think that way. Draconis dragons.
You would
Right
think
here.
there would be dragons, right?
Yeah, I mean, like I can see 2 dragons on the cover easily. So not in the spoilers in that. All right. Talking a little bit about this book, because it is a huge book, but again, the pace is really fast and you keep on switching chapters. It is quite different, again, similar from what you said, with the Great Hearts, you only had one POV, there's dual timelines. In this book, there's no dual timelines, there's just one single timeline. And there's a multi-POV structure. There's at least 4 to 5 POVs, if I'm not wrong, in this book. Was this on purpose?
It was. So I enjoyed writing in the first person for the Great Hearts, but I wanted to do something slightly different. I think third person really gives you the ability to tell a story from obviously from multiple perspectives. I think there's been a number of times when I've been writing the Great Hearts, as you mentioned, kind of the second and third ones, you do see some smaller sections of different POVs where I thought, well, this would have been much easier to have written in third person because I could have, built this out much more. Whereas you're kind of confined to that single view. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It gives you the ability to do great character development. Obviously, it's all from that one person's kind of perspective. But I think Draconis, not going to lie, a large part of me always wanted to make a kind of epic fantasy tome. The things that I used to read growing up and still read now. And I think a large part of me felt that, well, that's going to have to be third person, and it's going to be multiple perspectives, and that I think it's very easy to snowball, because all of a sudden, if you have a chapter with whereas in the Great Hearts, it's one chapter, it's one person, it's very streamlined. If you have a chapter and you have 5, 6 viewpoints, it becomes quite a long chapter, and all of a sudden you have a very large book. And the original draft of Draconis was 246,000 words. So that's been cut down by a good kind of 40k or so to kind of for the final edit. So yeah, it is a pretty big book. I think it tells the story in the way I wanted it to. And yeah, it's been a really interesting learning experience doing it from that third person and interweaving stories. It's been, I feel like probably the competing timelines and things in the Great Hearts has helped me with that. But I still have had to plan a fair bit more than I had to do with the Great Hearts, I think, for Draconis. There was a lot more plot points and things that I actually had to note down and jot down.
Oh, wow. Okay. So more fun things for us to look forward to. All right. You happened to mention that, when you first were writing this, you kind of thought that it was going to be either like one big, huge book or maybe 2 big books. If you were now having written the first book, what do you think? Is it going to be a trilogy or a duology?
It's either going to be the second book is probably going to be twice the size, or it will be 3 similar sized books, I reckon. When I first started writing it, I thought a duology would be quite nice, because it would be, in some ways, I think that's quite nice for a reader. They don't, everything's a trilogy, or, they might have read my other books and gone, oh, that means he's going to write 6 of them or something like that, But I think I'm still building the world in my own mind. And I have plans for it. So the Draconis Descendant saga, so to speak, I one of my plans is to kind of, or one of my thoughts is what happens once I've wrapped this story up. And I think that is going to be potentially, if I decide to carry this forwards, what's the world look like in, say, 100 years time, 200 years time, 300 years time. So that would be very, very heavily influenced by kind of, if you've read the Wax and Wane trilogy by Brandon Sanderson, the same principle, right? So technology, for anyone, hopefully not too spoilery, but for anyone who's read or reading Draconis, obviously they go into this portal, new world, new lands, new magic. And what you read in the first book, at least, is based on, you know, the initial explorations with that magic and what they can do with it, and combining it with technology. Now, one of my thoughts is, yeah, once I've wrapped up this duology or trilogy, yeah, 300 years from now, 500 years from now, is that just completely something else entirely? You know, how does that world look? So that's intriguing me as a potential. But yeah, for the moment, the second book I'm about 40,000 words through, mainly because I cut those from the first book. And that's going to have another POV, which will be essentially the big bad.
Yes.
So that's going to get built out, and it's either, I say, either all going to be in the second book, or likely the third book will be where everything explodes and, you know, everything gets rectified and so on and so forth. But we'll see. I'll keep you updated.
Perfect. Well, fingers crossed. I don't mind more books from you, so I'm not going to complain. Even if it's a big second book, or if it's 2 more books, either which way is good. Because yeah, the way you end this book, you have a knack for like ending it on such a huge hook. And again, I'm not going to spoil this, but the ending of this book is absolutely scary, so as to speak, for the inhabitants of this world. Is all I'm going to say. All right, you kind of preempted my question, the next question, a little bit, but I do want to ask you this, like, you know, now that you have these potentially 2 series, you know, you're obviously going to work on Great Hearts. We release a Great Hearts book. You're probably going to release a Draconis book and see how that goes. What other ideas would you want to explore once these 2 series are done? Do you have any plans, or are you just going to wait?
There's no burning other ideas in my head at the moment. I do jot down a couple of ideas every now and again, but there's nothing that's had kind of the same urgency that the idea for Draconis had when I finished the Great Hearts, for instance. I do think a large part of me is saying I'm not allowed to start anything else. If I was a full-time writer, then sure, I think that'd be fine. But yeah, it's hard enough finding the time to write a couple of thousand words kind of a week at the moment. So I have to figure out which ones to dedicate those to. So at the moment, it'll be Great Hearts 4, maybe Great Hearts 5 following that, and then probably a Draconis book. But the Draconis book is obviously going to be 200,000 plus, which means it's going to take a fairly long time to write, a fairly long time to come out. So apologies to anyone who's just read that and be left on this ridiculous cliffhanger. It will be a little while. I'll try and release some snippets. But yeah, I think if I do anything, it will either be potentially novella to expand the Great Hearts world. It's something I've been toying with, to potentially do it from a different person's perspective, maybe some of the other colleagues, you know, Recall, Scythe, people like that, just to flesh them out on potential missions and things that they do through the academy, because you only see it from Caladan's perspective. Or, as I say, when I finished Draconis, maybe taking it into the future, but we'll see when we get there.
Well, fingers crossed. I love the idea of the novellas and exploring other characters in the Great Hearts world, because that world is so exciting and it has so many facets. And you, of course, because of the singular POV, you're bound by Caladan. I'm not saying that Caladan's boring, because it's exciting, you know, what's happening with him in both the dual timelines. So, but still, yeah, there's, for example, the tracker. You know, I know you had asked you this in an email, like what happened to the tracker after book 1, but you kind of have hinted at that at the end of book 3, like, you know, what is potentially happening. And so that kind of hints at he's going to come back. Yeah. So yeah, hopefully more of this stuff. So that would be great.
Yeah, I can guarantee that the tracker is much more heavily involved in book 4. He's already got a number of chapters dedicated.
Nice. So what do you do when you're not writing? What hobbies and, you know, or proclivities keep you busy?
So I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm very much into climbing, gymnastics. Pre-COVID, I was lots into gymnastics and martial arts. I've kind of done martial arts since I was 5, of some shape or form. And then got a lot more into climbing in the last couple of years. I live in the Bristol, so anyone from the UK probably knows that Bristol is kind of a pretty popular place for climbers. You got Wales kind of on the border, so a lot of easy access to really good kind of outdoor rock. So yeah, really into kind of those active sports. And I've also taken up HEMA, which I think a lot of fantasy authors have taken up recently. So sword fighting, historical European martial arts. There you go. So basically learning how to use different swords, which is very entertaining too. Other than that, it's writing, gaming. I think this background actually is from The Witcher, so obviously big on there. And so yeah, heavily into Elden Ring at the moment, and Total War Warhammer 3, if anyone recognizes that one. So that's kind of me. A lot of active stuff, and then kind of a bit more of the nerdy gaming kind of writing side of things, and as well as work, which is essentially, what no one wants to talk about. So yeah.
It pays the bills. It's necessary. So I completely understand on that. You on that front. Are you reading anything? Any interesting books nowadays? Any particular authors or books that you like to give like a shout out to?
Yeah, so I'm currently reading Dragon Mage by M.L. Spencer, and that is awesome. Loving it so at the moment. Great book, really fascinating world, really interesting use of magic system. The other kind of one that I really enjoyed recently was Iron Price Stormforged by Bryce O'Connor. It's kind of lit RPG set in a sci-fi kind of setting. So again, it's that good combination of things for me, which is kind of fantasy and sci-fi. So yeah, that was really well written. And I'm aware that it's actually two authors, so it's Bryce O'Connor and Luke
Chemelenko. Yeah,
that's the one. And yeah, they did a fantastic job with that. But Cradle, I read the number 10, the 10th book, Reaper, I think it was, last week, and it's a great read. If you haven't read it yet, fantastic read. And The Wandering Inn has kept my attention for a long time. That is I can see why so many people read The Wandering Inn. That is an excellent series, but I am only reading it on, I say only, I'm not reading it on the web serial, which is further ahead. I'm reading it and paying for it on Amazon, but just because I wanted to read it on my Kindle, to be honest, and it gives a bit of money. But yeah, that's fantastic. I recommend that for anyone who likes kind of lit RPG, but perhaps not quite as heavy into the kind of hard tables and facts and figures and things like that. Yeah, really worth checking out.
Wow, that is quite a lot of books. I have read Dragon Mage by M.L. Spencer. It was truly fantastic, and I'm hoping to looking forward to the sequel. I know it was a bit delayed, but I think it might be out later this year. I know Bryce. I have met him at Dragon Con, so I need to get into those series. But he's Bryce and Luke Chemelenko. They're both also the minds behind Wraithmark Publishing. So I know they're coming out with really cool books, and they're doing something really fantastic. So I will check out. I have heard of Wandering In. I haven't been able to get into it, so I will check that out as well. Well, this is really illuminating to know. Thank you again for your time today, David. And before we end off, is there anything else you would like to share with our viewers?
I think just thank you very much for obviously to yourself, Mihir, but also anyone who's watching this and wants to potentially, after you've heard all the trials and tribulations of the different books, check them out. Then that's awesome. I think anyone, you always take a chance with a self-published book, and especially Draconis, which has like almost no reviews at the moment aside from Mihir's. So you always take that chance because you don't know what you're going to get. I like to think that's exciting, but I appreciate anyone and everyone who does take that chance. And I think any self-published author would do as well. But yeah, just huge appreciation for yourself, Mihir. It's been I think you've been absolutely awesome with kind of the way you interact with a lot of, not just myself, but a lot of the kind of self-published community. Yeah, you've been absolutely awesome. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. You're too kind. I love books, so this is like awesome. You guys feed my addiction, so it's like in a healthy way. So this is the least I could do. All right. Well, thank you again, David, and for everybody else. You can check out the reviews. I'll be listing them below in the in the about section of this video. Please do give Draconis or the Great Hearts a read if you want. I can tell you the Great Heart books are like a fun mix, and I say fun with all the true intent of like dark fantasy, military school settings, enigmatic characters who there's heroic characters, there's villainous characters, and there's a lot of suspense and mystery on that. Draconis, on the other hand, it's this giant book of epic fantasy, well, epic-ish fantasy, but with lots of monsters, dragons as well, and there's also a mystery of actually what's truly going on. Do check out David's writing. His website will be listed below as well. He's a fantastic writer, and so David, thank you again and for listening and for coming onto this to this video cast. I truly want to thank you for your time. It's getting late, so I'm going to end it over here. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. I'll talk to you soon. Take care, David.
Thank you very much.